Hello YouTube, this is Hunter Surge with Cardfight Vanguard content. I love a lot of card games, so I'm going to be doing content for more and more card games that I love. And of the card games I love, Cardfight Vanguard is number one because Buddy Fight is already dead. But I have been an avid Vanguard player for a long time. Took a pretty sizable break in the middle of V. But this is the deck that got me back into the game, and we are about to hit DZ-9 release literally tomorrow, which brings a pretty significant upgrade to this deck. However, even for just my own documentation, I wanted to do a deck profile before we leave DZ-8, which has been another significant upgrade for this archetype. This is, of course, Direful Dolls. It is my favorite archetype in the game at current because it's a deck that makes guarding feel the most like it did back in G era and OG. So let's get into it. For the ride line, we of course have Mr. Android, Griselda, Serenella, and Tonya. The starter name does in fact matter. Well, that's some glare there. Let's see if we can fix that. Boop, boop. Okay, there we go. That's better. The starter name does, in fact, matter because there are times where you're going to have to call your starter out of Soul with Android in order to get the +1 drive. And for that purpose, you need Tonya to have the name. Serenella is a pretty great ride line piece. I really like deck thinning too, getting those pieces off the top 7. Griselda is an awful card that I hate. And unfortunately, the ride line as a whole is +0. A lot of this deck strengths are very similar to what Heart Luru that we're getting in set 9 is able to do, but one of the biggest differences between the decks, which makes Android not a tier 1 deck like Heart Luru is the fact that Heart Luru gets a +2 ride line and Android gets a +0 ride line. Griselda technically calls itself out, but the reality of Griselda is that 90% of your turn 3 scenarios, you're going to end up calling over this Griselda anyways, so it's not actually a meaningful +1, so it's effectively a +0. If Griselda got boost, it would be like Griselda getting boost adding that literal one word to this card would completely change how good this ride line is. It would make it a +1 ride line instantly because like it would be super easy to find space for a 10k to 15k booster in your back row. But as a card that does not get boost and is expected to be used in your front row, it just pales in comparison to like every other grade 2 or higher you have available. We of course run 3 Persona rides. The deck is fairly dependent on Persona Ride for power, but unlike the early iterations, you now have a lot of ways to dig for your Persona Ride. 3 copies of Liberata, a very good attacker who is very important for keeping your resource loop going. We're just going to go through the list quickly, and then we will circle back and talk about the details. 4 copies of Providenza, because you really need to see 2 copies of this card, hopefully by turn 4. So you want to have the 4 copies. 3 copies of Tarquinia. Despite being a card we really want to see on turn 2, 3 copies has, in my experience, been more than enough. I almost always have a copy of this to use on turn 2 if I want it. 3 copies of the Persona Shield cycle, Ravos, has been very good for me. We'll get into that in a bit. 4 copies of Consolata. We absolutely want 4 of this because its when placed from hand filter effect is extremely strong, and it also represents an 18k booster. So the more of these we can get onto our board during our push turns, the better. So we really want to draw into more copies of them. We really appreciate it. 2 copies of Bartolomea. This is the countercharger. This deck really does not particularly need countercharge to do its thing. It really just needs to do the 1 counterblast for Android. And there are often scenarios where you can still do like a basic 4 attack setup even without the counterblast to spend on Android. You lose the drive check and your field won't be as ideal. So like because of that, having countercharge is not super necessary What this card actually represents is an effective 13k booster. It also draws a card because your boards will almost always have a Liberata on them at some point in the board. So getting to counter charge means you get to freely use the counterblast to draw effect of Liberata. That is what that card actually represents. Then we have 3 copies of Filia. We will get into this more, but this card has been absolutely critical in my testing. It can be a bit awkward because we have no way to guarantee an order, but what it provides to the deck is far too important to be passing up. 4 copies of the set order promo for Now Forget the Passage of Time. For Regalis piece, we have Fire Regalis. Then we have 4 PGs, no Sanctitude. Triple drive decks just don't really exist, and I'd much rather have access to the potentially free PG effect, which has been coming out more and more recently. Then we have 8 critical triggers, all vanillas, 3 fronts with the 20k shield, and then 2 Direful Doll heals, 2 of the restand heal. I honestly might bump this up to 4 restand heals, and then our over trigger is the Dark States OT. To go over OT choice real quick, I have dabbled with a number of OTs in Direful Dolls over my time using it. I've really liked yellow in the past. Blue is also super solid. However, Dark States is where I'm currently at because despite the deck now being built in such a way to be very aggressive and try to end games quickly, this still does represent a critical trigger, but more importantly, the deck is still very capable of surviving for a very long time. And the longer the game goes, the more value this card gets, especially in a deck like this, where the Vanguard swing is always the weakest swing. So giving that a permanent crit to force the opponent to be guarding it very seriously, is a really big deal. So I have been finding this to be pretty high impact lately. Though the yellow OT's board wipe is also really strong, and I kind of miss it because we don't have in-engine removal at the moment. I really miss when I was able to run clean sweep, but we just don't have the space for it anymore. But yeah. So let's get into the details. So for those unfamiliar with Direful Dolls, the basic game plan of the deck is that you have a really good resource loop. You get stuff into Soul initially with effects like Serenella, and Serenella's top 7, put 2 into Soul, Griselda's On Call, and Constellata's look top 5. Then you use Android's ability, Counterblast 1, to call out 2 to 3 dolls depending on the grade our opponent is on. If we're against a grade 4, we also get to call out 4. If we're against Griffogella, we get to call however many we want. It's just based on the opponent's Vanguard's grade. So if we're going first, turn 3, we will be calling out 2. And if we're going second, turn 3, we will be calling out 3. And if it calls out 3 or more, it gets an extra drive check. So we're a 3 drive deck. So we just get to build a board super free all the time. Then from there, after our Direful Dolls swing, they will bind themselves. And during our opponent's turn, we can use the Direful Dolls in our bind once per battle to guard, and they get plus 5k shield. And then we use effects like Liberata's effect when placed on rear guard or guardian circle to put a Direful Doll from our drop back into our soul. And the effect of For Now Forget the Passage of Time, the set order, that can drop itself to put 2 different Direful Dolls from our drop zone into our soul. Now, there was another card that the deck used to run, that a lot of builds are actually still running, that does this. Direful Doll Pelagia. So, Direful Doll Pelagia is a grade 1 that, when it boosts, puts 2 Direful Dolls from our drop zone into our soul. And it always has plus 5k shield. So, when called from bind, with Android's effect, it is a 15k shield, and it can just be a 10k shield from hand. So there are 2 fundamental issues with Pelagia. The first is an issue the card always had, in that because its soul gaining effect happens in the battle phase, it's very dependent on us getting a ton of copies of our key pieces into rotation before it starts becoming really good and being able to actually set us up for our next turn. This has always been a problem with the card, always been an annoyance with the card. It's why Liberata has always been the far better way of ensuring our setup. because while it does have the when placed on rear effect, which is typically going to happen during the battle phase, when it's called out mid-battle phase, it also has the effect when placed on Guardian Circle, which allows us to do stuff where like we just order our guards correctly. So we guard with whatever card we want to put in with Liberata, and then on the next battle we guard with Liberata, put in the thing we want. It was like a 5-attack turn where we ended up going through multiple Liberatas. We are going to be able to set up 2 in our soul, and that's usually enough to ensure we get all the setup we need for that incoming turn. The set order has been a really big deal for helping this setup. Being in the main phase is way, way, way better than Pelagia ever was. But the biggest problem with Pelagia is that our board space is very precious. And Pelagia is only an AK. Like, compare Pelagia's AK and setup for our next turn to what our other boosters are doing. Consolata is effectively an 18k booster. This card, first when it's placed from hand, we get to look top 5 opponent Direful Doll from among them into our soul. But its second effect is when any of our other rear guards are bound while we have a grade 3 or greater Direful Doll Vanguard, we get to bind the Consolata and give plus 5k to 2 different cards on the field. It's an effective 18k booster that pans out a lot better than an 18k booster because you're able to spread that 18k across 3 different attacks if you so desire. Or you can stack both buffs on the same column. And you can, of course, trigger multiple of these and get a ton of power onto your board. And it doesn't care about your opponent being on grade 3 at all. Bartolomea, as we talked about before, is effectively a 13k and countercharge 1, which actually translates to 13k and draw a card. And similarly, Filia is a 13k booster that draws a card. The new card we'll be getting in the next set is yet another 13k draw card that is also an 8k draw card in the early game. So, like, there just is... It's very hard to justify space on the board for Pelagia. And frankly, Liberata and the set order are, in most scenarios, enough. I have dabbled in the past with builds that run a 1-of tech of Pelagia because you have so many effects that look top 5 to 7 for Direful Doll that you're able to find that 1-of pretty consistently and have access to it for the scenarios where you want it, which is like matchups that go really long, like Ava. Can go particularly long because both of these decks have very strong defensive capabilities. But overall, I've just found Pelagia very much unneeded in the current state of the deck. Because we are trying to leverage our deck thin and our very strong turn 2 and 1 to win quickly before a deck like, say, Baf Sarga is able to stabilize. If we need to go long, the deck is still very capable of that, but that is not what we are aiming to accomplish. We're aiming to win quickly. To that end, Filia is very, very critical. This is a card I did not actually add until like the day before my BSF in Toronto, which was just a couple weeks ago. And this card has been absolutely critical. One of the biggest flaws the deck has had for a bit, ever since it got its very strong turn 2 and turn 1 capabilities now thanks to Consolata. Consolata contributes a lot there because you can just commit it early game, no problem, get your deck thin, and then if your opponent swings into it, that's fine, you can get it back into Soul with your drop Soul effects. But if they don't, well, you have it on the board already for your turn 3 to give more power to that turn 3, which is very, very nice. Very often, turn 1 going second, I'll just have 2 Consolatas in hand. I'll just go, okay, call Consolata to this front row, call Consolata to the other front row. Tri-lane turn 1, I have no cons with doing this because all I'm losing is 5k shields. And these are, if these survive, great. They're going to be high value turn 3. And if they don't, great. I've taken pressure off of my Vanguard. Yeah, so Filia is very critical because while we have very good ability to flood our board turn 1 and 2, the problem is, barring turn 2 going first, none of those columns are resistant to a single damage trigger. They cap out at 18k, there's no additional power anywhere, and frankly, we just really needed a way to get additional power on the board. And given many people don't commit much early, especially Baf Sarga, and we have a set order in the deck that we can play as early as turn 1 if need be. Filia became the natural fit for getting that extra power. 13k and like replace itself after we shove it in. Just fantastic. Really, really good. The deck has felt so much stronger since doing that because it makes my my turn 1 and turn 2 pushes so much more real than they were before. It's also like, even in the later stages of the game, it is very frequently very nice to be able to just go, okay, there's enough scenarios where like you're not able to fill up the entire board again. And having another like good booster to throw down on your board is pretty nice. Similarly for that early game stuff, Ravos has been very, very good for the deck. I actually very rarely use Ravos by discarding. I'm almost always using Ravos by calling it to my front row. And effectively getting 15k shield while getting an attacker. Pretty great stuff. Now, a lot of why I like Ravos so much is because we might be on 4 Providenza, but what you often want to be doing on turn 2 is you want to try to hold a Providenza in your hand. Because the way the turn 2 typically shakes out is you only have 1 damage. And you typically have access to a Tarquinia, which you're going to call, counterblast 1, look top 5 to add a Direful Doll from your deck to your hand, from those top 5 to your hand, to help you fill out that board. But that means that going into your opponent's next turn, you have no damage face up, and they can potentially damage deny you. However, damage denying is of actually limited effectiveness against Direful Dolls, especially in the scenario this is most likely happening, which is you went first. So you're going into your first turn 3 with your opponent on grade 2 still. And in that scenario, Android's counterblast 1 skill is actually pretty low value. Because we can't get the extra drive check from it anyways, and we can only call 2. So it is very, very worthwhile to hold a Providenza in our hand on that turn 2, so that if our opponent decides to damage deny us, we can just go, okay, my turn, I'm just going to call Providenza, and I'm still going to do 4 attacks. And that is very, very nice. Very good stuff there. What else is there to really talk about? Not much, honestly. I would be careful with the set order. Always be careful with the set order, because it might be a grade 1, but that's very deceptive. Unfortunately, for some reason, this set order has a grade restriction on the card you add. So when you play this set order, I didn't even mention this. When you play this set order, you get to look top 7 and add a Direful Doll from among them to your hand. Except, for some reason, unlike most add-to-hand effects, this has a grade restriction based on your Vanguard. So, like, if you're on grade 1, you can only add these 6 cards. And if you're grade 2, you can't add the Liberatas and Androids. So if you have only one of this set order in your hand early, it is very important to be careful about when you're playing it down. You should be looking at your hand and your soul and recognizing, okay, what pieces do I need here? Like, do I need like more Providenzas or like more of my grade 1s? Then playing it turn 2, pretty valuable. However, if you're missing like Persona Ride and like don't even have 1 copy of Liberata, then you probably want to save it for turn 3 so that if you see either of those off that top 7, you're able to get them. Also, the Direful Doll names in the triggers, while we don't run the Sparta, short Sparta in the current build that was able to bind Direful Doll triggers from our soul that we could then guard with. So there's no in archetype reason for the Direful Doll names at the moment. However, like nothing that's really proactive into most matchups, at least. However, it is still very good to have these Direful Doll name triggers, because if you fight Shiranui, there's a scenario that you can set up with decent frequency where going into their first dry turn, you can end your turn with no cards on your field and also no units in your drop zone. And in that scenario, they just don't have a turn. And you can only, like, Direful Doll triggers are very important for that, because Direful Doll triggers can be put into your soul from your drop. So you can guard with a trigger. Direful Doll triggers allow you to still guard with a trigger or discard a trigger for ride line, and then and then put them into Soul so that they're not in the drop zone. However, if your opponent has to call a trigger for their Dominate swings, like that's also pretty fine. That's just a 5k shield. Yeah. But yeah, that's a fun little thing you're able to do to Shiranui with decent frequency, and it's pretty sick anytime it happens. Pretty awesome. And yeah, I think that's really all there is to talk about. The Griselda problem, of course, is that Liberata gets plus 10k, Providenza gets plus 10k and allows multi-attacks, and Tarquinia also gets plus 10k. Even Ravos is getting plus 5k, even if we're not really leaving it on the field going into our turn 3 attacks. So there's just these no space for a card like Griselda that just gets the plus 5k. Also, of note, you might notice that I was talking earlier about how none of the Direful Dolls get power on turn 2, and that's why we're running Philia. And you might go, if you're a Direful Doll duelist, you might go, wait, but Griselda gains power. Why don't you just use that? Well, the problem is that Griselda needs to put in a Direful Doll specifically. And typically, on our turn 2, we're calling like every Direful Doll in our hand. And the ones we aren't are like the Providenza that we are deliberately trying to hold in our hand so that we can hedge against damage denial, or Persona Rides that we don't want to put in, or triggers that we don't want to just lose from our hand. So running main deck copies of Griselda just for the power gain just doesn't line up well. Like it's super annoying because when the power gain effect is useful, those are stages in the game where it tends to be very difficult to put a Direful Doll into our Soul. However, there are also scenarios in like the mid game after we've hit grade 3 where like mid battle we will want to call out a Griselda for the filter. But in that scenario, the power gain is pretty lackluster. And especially since our Vanguard has almost always already attacked that turn. And the reason why we're making that decision is based on cards that we drove check off of Android. So like it's just such an awkward effect. It's such an awkward card. It's so annoying. I hate this card. I hate Griselda so much, man. This card's so bad. It's so bad, man. It's so bad. The Regalis piece could also be twin cast if you want. I prefer Fire Regalis to help to give us more deck fin, give us even stronger early game. That stuff is really great. And like if I never mentioned it, but like Providenza is our source of multi-attack. It at the end of its battle it can EB3 and bind itself to call another Direful Doll from our Soul with a different name. That's why we need 4 copies of it, because ideally we want to at least one turn of the game, because since it costs energy, we can, if we're going first, we can only do 1 5 attack turn, sorry. And going second, we can do 2. But we want to be able to set up at some stages in the game, ideally for our Persona Ride turn, 2 Providenzas, so that we can call them both out, and do our 5 attacks. Also important to note with Providenza, so Bartolomea very specifically has to bind another normal unit on our field and then throws itself to bottom. So the way these 2 cards work is that when they attack, you have the option to give them plus 10k, and then when you do so, they create an end of battle trigger to bind themselves. However, this also triggers end of battle, so you can just resolve Bartolomea first and bind the card that's already going to bind itself. And it's particularly relevant with Liberata, because when you do this, Liberata still attempts to resolve that effect. It attempts to bind, it's already done that, but that isn't conditional for the next part of the effect, which is the Counterblast 1 draw card. So you're able to just go, okay, boost Liberata with Bartolomea, end of battle, bind the Liberata with Bartolomea, countercharge, and then immediately counterblast with the damage we just unflipped to draw a card. Which is very, very nice stuff to be able to do. And yeah, I don't think there's really anything else to touch on the deck. As I said before, I think there's very good merit to running 4 restand heals, because the 25k shield is very, very valuable. And we are currently in a format where almost every meta deck is a restand deck. Crit heals are also pretty decent, but most of the deck that hits also get hit by this, so it's like whatever, it's fine. Yeah. Also, very nice with that in mind, because there are a number of decks that are running a bunch of restand heals. We do not get hit by the crit heals or the restand heals. Neither of them touch us. We're completely immune to them, which is unless we are very specifically at a point where our Dark States OT has gone off, then we can get hit by the crit heal, but that's it. Not really a big deal. I think so. Actually, I haven't checked the crit heal in a while. What is the specific wording on this thing? Pretty sure I have some copies. Yeah, I have a copy over here. Yeah, I don't believe the additional effect is considered a trigger effect. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not too sure how that functions. That's not important. It's not important. That's the deck profile. We will be back in the near future with the post DZ-9 deck profile featuring Finley. Very good card. But for now, this is Dolls. This is how I've been playing it for all of DZ-8. Went very positive. Best record on my team in the VPL. So you know, this deck works very well, very aggressive, and like has a good defensive game to fall back on. And don't let anyone fool you. If you know the deck and play good, you won't go to time. I have literally never gone... I've gone to time on this deck once. Once ever. The only time I've ever gone into time on this deck is in like DZ1 when the deck was much slower and my opponent hit a defensive OT and then resolved 2 more heals. That was the only time. Only time I've ever gone to time on this deck. Like, the time concerns with this deck are not real. They are not real. They're a lie. They're a trick. They're trying to trick you. They're trying to get you to not play Direful Dolls. You should play Direful Dolls. Alright. That's it. Goodbye.